All right. Good morning, good day, everyone. Um, I'm Bruno Charbonneau, I'm your host today. I'll wait a couple of minutes, just let people sign in and come in, and then we'll start. Thank you. Okay, I think we can begin. Good day, everyone. My name is Bruno Charbonneau. I'm Professor of International Relations at Royal Military College Saint-Jean, Canada, and the Senior Scientific Advisor to NATO Climate Change Security Center of Excellence. I am your host for the CASCO Speaker Series. Our speaker series aims at bringing our community together, at building bridges between different expertise and experience, at contributing to the production of common security knowledge, policy, and practices, at introducing you and us to different perspectives, and at encouraging healthy debates. This is our second episode today. Our format is pretty classic today. Our guest will speak for about 25 minutes, and then we'll open it up to questions. The conference part of our session will be available later on the CASCO website, our YouTube channel, if you want to share that. I encourage you also to submit your question in a Q&A tab that you should see on your screen. We will monitor it and use it to ask your questions to our guest during the Q&A period. So without further ado, I'm very pleased to introduce our guest and speaker in front of CASCO, I dare say, Caroline Baxter, Director of the Converging Risks Lab at the Council on Strategic Risks in Washington, D.C. Caroline, from 2021 to 2024, served as Deputy Assistant Secretary of Defense for Force Education and Training within the Office of the Secretary of Defense, in which capacity she served as the Principal Senior Authority on the development of DoD policy relating to the cognitive and physical preparations required by the Joint Force. In this role, Caroline created and led numerous high visibility coalitions charged with addressing foundational challenges facing the armed forces. Through her leadership, these coalitions forged a path-breaking methodology to strengthen operational resilience through deepening mission-centric knowledge, climate change, identified and secured billions of dollars of funding to close critical training gaps, inhibiting mission success, and devise a means by which to track and support learning outcomes in military education. For her work at the Department of Defense, Caroline was awarded the Department of Defense Medal for Distinguished Public Service, the highest award presented by the DoD to political appointees. Previously, Caroline Baxter spent over a decade conducting research on operational strategy, military doctrine, and operational readiness at the RAND Corporation, pardon me. Over the course of her time at RAND, Caroline Baxter was detailed to DoD twice, first to the Air Staff and then to the Office of the Undersecretary of Defense for Personal Readiness, where she served as Special Assistant to the Undersecretary. She holds a BA with honors in international relations from the University of St. Andrews and an MA in international security policy from the Columbia University School of International Public Affairs. It goes without saying, we're very happy to have her with us today. She will talk about what it means to insert, I guess, and think about climate change in the context of NATO warfighting capstone concept, pardon me. So Caroline, thank you very much for being with us today again. Very happy to see you and agreeing. And thank you very much for agreeing to do this. I'm very much looking forward to what you have to say. The floor is now yours.
All right. Thank you so much, Bruno. And hello, everyone. I was going to say it's great to see you. I can't see any of you. I think I'm probably a giant disembodied floating head on a screen. So it's great to be a giant head proximate to where you are sitting individually. Let me also thank CASCOE a whole lot for creating this fellowship series and allowing me to be part of the inaugural class. It was a real exciting opportunity for me to do some research that I have wanted to do for a very long time. My interest in the kind of operational aspects of climate change really started when I was at RAND, and I was doing a lot of work on basing access. And at the time was when President Obama had authored his famous and then sort of gently mocked pivot to the Pacific. And concomitant with that was the Air Force wanting to look at where it could base all of its assets in order to be more combat effective and all the rest of it. Putting aside all the politics of what the Air Force was asking, as I was doing that basing analysis, I found that the climate aspects and the extreme weather aspects were not only underanalyzed, but almost kind of hand-waved away as secondary or even not particularly important. And, a lot of the places that the Air Force wanted to put their stuff were in areas of extreme weather. And you can put anything you want in Guam or Saipan. But Guam and Saipan, being in the path of worsening typhoons, creates as much destruction from those storms as, say, the DF-21 would you're trying to avoid in the first place by putting the things in Guam and Saipan. So it really got me thinking about the operational impact of climate change. And part and parcel with that, how do you build effective plans, operational concepts, concepts for competition that include climate change as a critical factor for resilience, effectiveness, lethality, dare I say, and all the rest of it. So a few years after I then left RAND, I'm now serving in the Department of Defense, and that was around the same time that the Biden administration really throttled up on foregrounding climate change as a national security priority, which created a whole bunch of bureaucracy that I'm thrilled to say actually worked. Creating new bureaucracy doesn't always do that, but this one did. And one of the things that came out of one of the meetings was a quote from Deputy Secretary of Defense Kathleen Hicks, who said something to me that really struck a chord, which was nations that are most resilient and best able to manage the effects of climate change will gain a strategic advantage. We must prepare for and adapt to climate change better and faster than our competitors. And the better and faster than our competitors angle was pretty fresh at the time. It connoted that not only is dealing with climate change sort of a normative good, not only is it good for us to make sure that our stuff is going to be resilient to storms, our bases aren't going to wash out, but our adversaries, because climate change is global, which is a stupid thing to say out loud, but nonetheless, our adversaries are dealing with the exact same problems. And how they are considering their own resilience needs to be factored into our assessment of their capabilities as much as the strength of their defense industrial base or the speed of their technological advancement. Excuse me. So those states that are able to recognize the strategic and operational and tactical implications of climate change are really going to have the upper hand. So then in the broadest possible strokes, what the research I did for this fellowship looked at is how a good concept on its own can weaken its own relevance when it doesn't account for those worsening effects of climate change. And in a way, it's kind of a lens into how the lack of a systems level understanding of climate change affects the whole planning process and makes it less effective. There is a whole lot in this research that I did not cover. So in the Q&A, if there's something that I don't know, I will maybe counter to type of an American defense nerd. I will say, I do not know. But I will be excited to learn from you and also just kick the ball around on what it is that I did cover. What I tried to do is interrogate one document's kind of fitness for purpose. And the research that I did asked a pretty simple question. Is NATO preparing for and adapting to climate change effectively, like DepSecDef Hicks said, to ensure its combined military dominance on the battlefield in the future? And in one aspect, the answer is clearly yes. NATO has its climate change and security action plan. It has its annual climate change and security impact report. It has the CASCOE. But I think the question really is, does climate change exist outside of those dedicated documents? Because that's a really important tell. And that was one of the lessons that I learned in the Pentagon when I was trying to build climate literacy. When you create climate specific areas, be that a document or a group or an office, it allows those other people outside of those documents and offices that are pinned to it to kind of forget about it. And it reinforces the belief that climate change is a bit of a niche topic. Putting climate change in a box limits things. So you have to interrogate where you would expect climate change to be raised, but it is not. Where it does not appear is a pretty important lesson. So I examined what NATO is planning for its future capability requirements and its ability to close that gaps through reviewing a document that had been referred to as sort of NATO's North Star for warfare development imperatives, which is the NATO warfighting capstone concept. So let me go into a little bit of detail on what the NWCC is, and then I'll go into what I found out. So NWCC is relatively short. It's written by NATO Allied Transformation Command, NATO ACT, and it is the complement to the 2020 concept for deterrence and defense, which that focuses on what's required to deter and defend today. NATO Capstone concept is the future-oriented facet of how the alliance is supposed to execute the NATO military strategy. So it's a pretty high-level document that articulates what the alliance is going to need to be able to do to win wars in 2040. It is structured around 5 warfare development imperatives, WDIs, that provide kind of targeted pathways of military evolution to prepare for 2040 and to address capability development gaps or capability gaps along the way in what NATO, the NWCC calls the military instrument of power. So those WDIs are, and I'll go into detail over the course of my presentation. So I'll just do the top line now. They are cognitive superiority, layered resilience, influence and power projection, cross-domain command and control, and multi-domain defense. Let me skip to the conclusion and the classic bottom line up front. The NATO warfighting capstone concept does not deal with climate change. It doesn't address it. It doesn't really factor it into its assessments of the current capability gaps of the military instrument of power, or, and this is, I think, the shock to me when I was reading it over, the future operating environment. When I was reading over the NWCC, before I even decided to look at this as part of the research, the fact, and I'll go into this in the second WDI, the fact that in considering the future operating environment, it does not incorporate the shocks that NATO allies have already faced in terms of wildfires and floods and storms, melting tarmac, all the rest of it, was a real omission. And I think it kind of renders the progress one would make through using the NWCC as that North Star as kind of fundamentally uneven and a little bit ineffective, without accounting for the fact that Europe is the fastest warming continent, or the effects of climate change on NATO's adversaries, or the battlefields in which we're going to fight. The guidance is kind of incomplete. So if you were to follow the very well articulated and reasoned goals of the NWCC, you would need to have already in the background things that account for climate change. So put differently, if the NWCC were to kind of assume the inclusion of climate change and military education, or climate change in a mission essential task list, I think you'd be a little bit more confident that the goals of that document were sound. But as I'm going to talk about in the course of the research, those gaps that exist outside the NWCC make that particular document a little bit lacking. Does that mean that the problem lies with NATO ACT or with the NWCC? Not really. Like I said at the beginning, it's sort of a tell for the inability of that systems level understanding of climate change to get out of the documents that have been written about that and percolate all the way through the planning and operational concepts process, the acquisitions process, and so on and so forth. So now I'm going to go through each of the WDIs in turn. I promise I'm not going to talk for 1,000 years. I'm going to try to get through this relatively quickly, and then we can have a bit of a conversation. So the very first WDI is cognitive superiority, and that one is defined as understanding the operating environment and potential adversaries relative to the alliance's own capabilities, capacities, and objectives. So to fully realize this imperative in a climate change informed way, we would hope to have climate change incorporated into sort of the piece parts of cognitive superiority, right? You'd have education and training and exercise. Is that what we have today? Not exactly. In the American case, as everyone on this call has been tracking, of course, the DoD has been backsliding a little bit in its treatment of climate change or its acknowledgement of climate change as a factor. Before that happened, or during the Biden administration, the work that had been done was pretty remarkable given its speed. But still, I would still assess that climate change got a pretty heterogeneous treatment in terms of raising a collective appreciation of the ins and outs of why this makes it harder. It was still kind of pockets of knowledge. Didn't quite get to the point of effectively forging a joint understanding of, or a lexicon for, or an approach to climate change as a disruptor of military operations. And that lack of standardization exists a little bit across NATO members right now, where Canada includes a really robust amount of climate security information that's tracked to learning outcomes in the curriculum, which is great. On the other hand, the content of climate education in NATO's Climate Change and Security Action Plan is a little bit more on the environmental protection side, and it doesn't include standardized learning outcomes. So there's a little bit of a divergence of approaches. For training and exercises, again, the US has kind of backed up a little bit from including that. There is still an office on resilience, environment is still kind of treated, but climate change, not so much. And in the NATO context, European plans seem to rely on more of a single training platform as opposed to kind of mainstreaming that across all component militaries. So why does this matter? It matters because there aren't yet the component pieces in place, I would argue, to fully realize that cognitive superiority piece of the NWCC in a way that accounts for what a commander needs to be able to know about how climate change is going to make things harder. And that is not the NWCC's fault, right? The challenges of including climate knowledge into education and training and exercises, I would think, have as much to do with the structural issues with how militaries build and assess knowledge and proficiency as with the topics themselves. Like, for example, to be connected across all domains, as the WDI envisions, requires a really fully realized, which basically means planned for and procured, plan to achieve and measure jointness and interoperability between services and between nations. And that scaffolding also requires the ability to support trans-alliance decision-making that's informed by the most relevant, the most timely, critical topics. And that also still needs construction. So climate change is one of the piece parts of that, but the architecture still needs to be put in place. So I think on another component, and this is kind of where we are getting towards and the tail end of the Biden administration, but just ran out of time, candidly, performance management systems that account for and that foster mission critical knowledge needs to be either created or adjusted as well. And that was something that we recognized in the climate literacy space would have helped a lot. How you grade people's performance on not just what they do, but the knowledge that they're using to do it. And if you had the ability to include climate change as part of that, I think that would really accelerate the cognitive superiority part of the NWCC. So that's the first one. The second one on layered resilience. So NWCC defines this one as the ability to absorb shocks and fight on across all layers, military, civil military, and military civilian, in order to outlast and prevail against adversaries. It is noteworthy to me that the NWCC does not include climate change or extreme weather as one of those shocks. NATO's 2024 Climate Security Impact Report does, and it highlights the readiness and the resilience drain of natural disasters, as does a report by the European Land Force Commanders Association. But the Capstone concept does not. So let's assume that the NWCC was making a hat tip by inference that the piece parts of accounting for resilience and readiness were there. We'd have to ask, is that true? Does NATO now have the ability to absorb those shocks? If extreme weather were implied in that definition, would we be confident in NATO's ability to manage them? To answer that question, it's worth looking at how the shocks pop up now and the impact that it's already having. So we'll start with the US only because I think the National Guard is a valuable example of the stresses of having both the mandate to be prepared for natural disasters and combat at the same time. You know, the National Guard has a dual purpose mission that is unified under Title 32 of US Code, and that funds preparation for war and preparation for domestic response and support, because the Guard has two masters. It has the Department of Defense that needs the Guard to be trained and ready to surge to complement the active duty component, and the state governors who use the Guard for domestic reasons. Maintaining readiness for both missions requires a really delicate balance that is easier to maintain when demand for both jobs remains relatively predictable, relatively steady. But when demand on either side of the ledger becomes irregular, that stress on the force intensifies. And one of the reports that I read when I was digging into how we have absorbed shocks in the United States quoted a National Guardsman, I think this was 2022, as saying, it's not a balanced trade for the majority of Guard units. It is a categorical readiness and training loss for those units to conduct domestic operations at the expense of their operational mission training. And this should be a concern with rising demands on so many Guard units for domestic operations. It is interesting, I'll even upgrade that to notable, that even this administration has had to, no kidding, reckon with the readiness drain of all of this. And in the FY25 National Defense Authorization Act included Section 314 that had language to mandate wildfire response and prevention training for the National Guard. So it is already having to bake this in as something that they have to do as a matter of course. Now, going to the NATO context, none of this is a surprise to any NATO member nation. You know, in 2023 alone, the Canadian Armed Forces deployed to Latvia for Operation Reassurance, to the Indo-Pacific for Operation Horizon, to the Canadian Arctic for Operation Nanook, and managed to carve out about 2,000 or so forces for 4 months to battle the worst fire season in 30 years. So all of that had to happen at the same time, which is balancing, again, preparation for the kinetic fight while also having the ability to support domestic needs. Same thing in Spain. 2024, Spain's president authorized the largest peacetime deployment in the country's military history, sending 10,000 Spanish forces to help affected areas after those devastating floods. This use of military force for missions, far from the core tasks, stresses military readiness, and it forces some really hard choices. One of the other things that I read was a quote from 2022, where Major General Robert Glavaš, who was then the head of Slovenia's armed forces, the chief of general staff, admitted that using military personnel to respond to the wildfires at the time made it harder to train for armed conflict with an adversary. And he said, in this situation with Ukraine and wildfires, we're in a dilemma about how to balance. At one point, you need to decide what is important, this or that. So in the background of all this, obviously, are procurement choices, because you need to put money someplace to support your most important requirements, mostly kinetic, but as we'll see in some cases, for domestic disaster relief. In 2024, Portugal used recovery and resilience plan funds through the EU to buy 3 Blackhawks for their dedicated airborne fighting unit. And the following year, they bought 5 more, worth about 50 million euro. that is the same amount of money that Portugal planned to spend on improving their ISR capabilities. So if you only have €1 or $1 and you have to maximize your resilience across the board, that is a hard trade-off to make. So then, considering what this WDI demands, outlasting an adversary, fighting on, it's also worth considering what the adversary is doing, looking at Russia and China. And in a word, the answer is more. China's conception of its national security is holistic. It includes environmental security and resource security as one of its 11 components. And it's easy to understand why, because from China's perspective, stability is paramount. So anything that affects stability needs to be included in its understanding of how to maintain its national security. And climate change and its effects constitute those threats. So last year, in May 25, it released revisions to its military regulations for maintaining combat readiness. And those revisions included a new section on major non-war military operations involving disaster relief and other activities aimed at maintaining stability. So it's already thinking through how to achieve that balance. And Russia, at the same time, its 2021 national security strategy mentioned climate change 9 times, which is a noticeable break with its prior strategic document from 2015, which mentioned it only once. So what? So going back to the original question, are we confident in NATO's ability to manage the shocks from extreme weather? I would say not quite, especially because Spain's proposal to include resilience in budget contributions was not approved. So how NATO chooses to enhance its ability to execute these military goals in the face of a changing climate in a way that is more robust than its adversaries, kind of going back to DepSecDef Hicks's quote, will determine the strength of its layered resilience. The effectiveness of military strategies, arguably, depends really on the degree to which those forces can overcome those exogenous challenges and overmatch them and the adversary. I think in this case, NATO has a real opportunity to press its advantage on this through not only the sophistication of its weaponry, meaning procurement and the defense industrial base and technological innovation and whatnot, but the resilience of the entire military apparatus. And I think that's really going to be quite a game changer. The third WDI on influence and power projection is defined by shaping positively the environment to the alliance's strengths, including generating options and imposing dilemmas on adversaries. So then the question is raised, are we confident in NATO's ability to project power and influence today in the face of climate challenges? So to interrogate this, we look at what those challenges currently are. The American context is unique, if only for the size of our military, our geography, and our global network of bases. But the individual components of how we've dealt with climate change are not. Everything I'm going to mention is something that a NATO ally has also dealt with too. The inability to to move our Army stocks and Army equipment by rail. 70% of our Army stuff has to go by rail. And the sun kinks that occur and have occurred frequently because of rising temperatures that make those tracks warp is a major problem for power projection. It slows us down. Also, rail along the coastal corridors, especially in California, they face serious sea level rise and also coastal erosion. And once that goes, then you have to reroute a whole bunch of stuff, and that's really complicated. In terms of the Navy and naval assets, Norfolk is the world's largest naval base, and it is facing the fastest sea level rise on the U.S. East Coast. And warming seawater is impairing our ability to cool our systems on aircraft carriers. F-35s struggle near thunderstorms. They don't tolerate extreme temperatures all that well. And some aircraft can't even take off because the tarmac has melted. And at the same time, hotter and wetter air reduces the lift capacity for helicopters, which really strikes at the heart of how Marine Air Ground Task Force, or MAGTFs, self-sustain and provide close air support. So anywhere you slice it, all 5 services deal with this. And I'll get to Space Force in pursuit of the 4th and 5th WDI. But all of those examples, hotter tarmac, Britain dealt with that. Wildfires getting in the way of deployment, Greece has dealt with that. Rising sea level and coastal erosion and the sun kinks, NATO has dealt with all of those too. As it relates to influence, by which I mean specifically nuclear and missile defense missions, climate change makes all of that more complicated now. The bases in Europe where the US keeps its weapons and where NATO allies provide the dual capable aircraft required to deploy those weapons have already felt the effects of a changing climate, and projections obviously suggest that that's going to get much worse by 2040. US-based capabilities like Naval Submarine Base Kings Bay in Georgia, the only strategic submarine base on the East Coast, is already facing navigability issues because sea level rise and erosion. It's getting harder to get and navigate out of Kings Bay to the open ocean. Sea level rise is also weakening the only route between the place where we house and maintain and assemble our Trident II D5 missiles and their warheads, and then the submarines for loading. There's one way that we do that, and that's already getting a little complicated. Minot in North Dakota, where we've got our B-52s, faces flood risk, and Whiteman Air Force Base, where we have our B-2s, faces twice as many 90-degree days over the next couple decades, which is going to weaken resilience. It's going to affect cooling systems, training days, carrying capacity of aircraft, might even ground the planes outright. So then the question, are we able to reliably project power and influence? Kinda, but even here you have to understand your risk tolerance for how much are you willing to degrade that and still reliably contend that you have influence and the ability to project power when you need it. You know, the more rapidly the climate changes, the greater likelihood we're going to have to dedicate portions of our budgets to adaptation in order to preserve those tools of influence, which is going to siphon money away from other priorities. And all of this depends upon credibility, right? That adversaries and allies need to have the confidence in our ability to follow through on our plans, which is obviously related to shelling and the theory of coercion. And whatever undermines our ability to project power, to respond at a time and place of our choosing, weakens that influence, and it really demands our attention. And this is the counterpart to the previous WDI and layered resilience, where any additional readiness preserved through increasing layered resilience is null and void if the military can't deploy from a washed out airstrip or a damaged seaport. So now we're going to get to the last two WDIs. I promise I'm going to wrap this up soon. The fourth and fifth WDIs, to me, mutually reinforced because they shared a common backbone. So cross-domain command and control, the ability to operate in a complex system simultaneously across physical and non-physical domains, and multi-domain defense, providing a framework for the integration of sensors, shooters, command and control systems, creating interoperable capabilities to build and maintain a multi-domain defense framework. The backbone of both of those is technology. Both WDIs depend on agility, which means the ability to dynamically retask forces and assets in real time in response to how a battlefield is evolving. Agility, in turn, depends on time to maintain that, what we called in the DoD back when I was there, decision advantage, possessing a faster OODA loop than an adversary. And you get agility and time through technology. Technology, when built and maintained with resilience in mind, can create that time. So the question for the fourth and fifth WDIs are, do we have technology now that we are confident will remain operational and effective over the next 14 years as the climate changes, things get more random, temperatures are hotter and colder, wetter and drier in ways that we aren't particularly prepared for? And in this particular case, the answer, again, and I am, I guess, a bit of a broken record, not really. Climate change already is making some of these assets like space-based capabilities and ISR capabilities and computing and communications a lot more vulnerable. So for space, NASA has been aware for at least a decade that sea level rise threatens its ground launch capabilities because more than 60% of NASA's facilities are close to sea level. Now, once aloft, those launch satellites have to connect to ground stations for GPS and navigation, and those ground stations are already facing structural integrity problems from permafrost thaw and wildfires and floods. Now, for ISR, NATO's fleet of E-3 AWACS is based in Geilenkirchen, Germany, which about 7 years ago, I think, broke Germany's record for extreme heat. And that's a problem because during the Iraq War, high temperatures made the radar way too hot for maintainers to work on. So it's already going to throw off the performance of the E-3. Now, the propagation of greenhouse gases, and this really blew my mind when I read about this, has begun to affect the viability of communications equipment that operate in high frequency and very high frequency ranges, which means there's more noise, there's more frequent disruption in communications, which means safety. And that means that the telecommunications industry might need to adjust some of the frequencies and facility design in the future, according to one of the reports that I read. So what of all of this? What this means is that the military instrument of power, as the NWCC defines it, is going to fail to achieve the operational capability for the battlefield in 2040, especially considering how we are running hell for leather for higher and higher technology battles and higher, more capability in technology for our kit, especially in terms of things like AI, unless we develop communication systems that not only can overmatch the adversaries, but can withstand climatological impacts. You know, ISR, unmanned ISR that can't take off because the tarmac has melted, and satellite ground stations that can't track or command assets in orbit, leave Allied forces completely blind and provide opportunities that an adversary can exploit. And anything that imperils that capability needs to be treated as seriously as if an adversary, oh, I don't know, stole Western sonar technology to protect its submarines, which is something Russia has done. So we already have corollaries of adversaries getting in the way of how our kit works. That is already kind of happening from a climatological perspective. So it's not that much of a stretch to use things that we already have to deal with the climatological problem that is, you know, operationally or tactically the same, strategically the same, as if an adversary had done the same thing. So this is all very, very bad. What do we do? I have 10 recommendations in the paper that I wrote across all these WDIs. I am not going to read all 10. I'll never be invited back. But I think the good news story here is that there are very clear pathways for action across all 5 of these WDIs that build on things that are already happening. So, for example, cognitive superiority. A standardized treatment of climate change with established learning outcomes would add a lot of structure to the good work that is already underway. And if I can be so bold as to offer a tasking, I think NATO CASCOE would be a prime organization to take the lead on driving what those learning outcomes are, given its remit. For European nations more broadly, standardizing climate change through Emilio, which is already thinking about layering climate change, it already has layered climate change into its educational offerings, would also, I think, forge that kind of unified cognitive superiority through awareness of the strategic and operational and tactical impacts. For layered resilience, considering updating the rosters of mission essential task requirements, called in the United States mission essential task lists or medals, and then offloading legitimate response capabilities to civilian-led organizations, rooting this effort within the framework of NATO Article 3 on civilian preparedness. And you can build off of the work done by the Nordic ministers for regional policy in October 2023. And influence and power projection, stretching military funding, supercharging defense innovation to engineer more efficient capabilities is essential, and I think something that we've already kind of seen. Cross-domain and multi-domain defense, harmonizing capability development with climate realism. That means, by my lights, adding kind of a climate overlay to the updated defense procurement, defense production action plan, the first NATO commercial space strategy, the rapid adaptation or adoption action plan, to ensure that they really generate those lasting solutions. So all that to say, and this is where I'll end, and I'll look forward to the Q&A. The worst outcome is creating new bureaucracy, right? New silos, new, cul-de-sacs of excellence, as we used to say with the derision in the building, that continue to keep climate change apart from how military strategies and concepts are authored. Another way to put this is no amount of climate realism in the NWCC can make up for a lack of climate realism in the other parts of the defense planning world, like acquisition and procurement and operational concepts and plans and the designs of weapon systems critically. So the report as written offered a kind of a glimpse into the challenges that are involved in drafting these kind of high-level concepts in an ecosystem that does not have that systems level understanding of a changing climate. And it affirms that, at least to me, those who work within those systems need to have the tools to affect those changes in a kind of synchronized way, which is one of the reasons I think that the NATO CASCOE and then this community of practice is so incredibly important, because it is a representation of people that work across these ecosystems that can then come together to figure out how to then, when they break apart, find a way to inject this stuff where it matters at a level that makes the most sense for the people whose jobs are fighting and winning our nation's wars together. So I will leave it there. Thank you very much. I hope I didn't go on too long, and I'll look forward to your questions.
Thank you very much, Caroline. Very good as always. We have about 20 minutes for Q&A, so I invite people to write their questions using the Q&R tab, I think. But just maybe to break the ice very quickly while people write down their questions. As you know, in the last year, the context has changed somewhat drastically. On the one hand, climate change has become unfashionable. At the same time, from my point of view, people are still working on it. But I think the other part of that context is and certainly here from my chair in Canada, the context of incredibly increasing defense budgets, and that's a context I think that's across I don't know if it's across the whole of NATO, but pretty much it is, I think. So I guess I'm just wondering in this context where governments like in Canada, they're promising like almost a tripling of defense budget in the next between now and 2030, 35 or something like that. What do you see as an opportunity or opportunities and risks in that context? Because I don't think that the conversation about climate change and security and defense has entered the conversation about what to do with that sort of new era of defense spending and budgets. So just wondering where you think the risk priorities, the opportunities are in the current moment.
No, it's a good question. It's a hell of a moment we find ourselves in, isn't it? I would say, and this might sound a little bit left field, but it's something I've been thinking about a lot. I think there's an opportunity to kind of piggyback onto the AI push. And what I mean by that is there is an enormous amount of investment in time, in personnel, in money, in compute that's going into artificial intelligence as I'll say a little bit of a bet on the future of how warfare is going to be executed. From everything from operational concepts that are generated with an LLM as a tool to agentic drones that have their tasking order and they just take it away. And we're learning lessons in real time, for better and worse, right now during the war in Iran. And I think the AI push is an opportunity because it's going to force a reckoning of resilience for these systems that are going to be pretty exquisite, very expensive, and you're going to need them to work for a long time. So that means everything from the water and energy that powers the data centers to the potential push to push them downrange. And then you have your physical and operational preservation of whatever the data center is where you're going to put that stuff. And anytime you have a high risk, high reward bet, you want to have a little bit of like cotton balling around it to preserve it from any kind of exogenous shock that could throw it off. Now, when you think about where AI is going to be deployed from a data center perspective, a lot of the places that we're seeing it are in places that are already really vulnerable to climate change. Now, I mean, you could make the argument that every place is vulnerable to climate change, and you would be obviously correct. But one of the places in the United States, for example, is Nevada. Now, Nevada is undergoing one of the worst droughts since the Dust Bowl, and AI demands an enormous amount of water. So all of that to say, the conversations inherent in planning for where we're going to put this stuff are, as a matter of course, incorporating, maybe not by name, but by content, climatological impacts, climatological realism. So for everyone on this call who is probably trying to figure out how to continue to do this work in I'll say, different political environment, pigging back or hearkening back to what we talked about in the building when I was there, the lexicon of climate change. there is a way to talk about climate realism, climate effects without saying climate change at all. And I think that's going to be part and parcel of how we maintain the awareness of just the math and physics of how this screws things up in a environment that is not conducive to listening to that point being made. And I think putting it in the realm of, all right, if you want a whole bunch of agentic swarms of drones that are going to be powered by X, Y, or Z thing, where are you going to put the power? How are you going to preserve that power from an operational perspective, not just from an enemy, dropping a missile on it or short circuiting it or whatnot, but from a drought that's going to cut off the water supply and you can't cool the data center anymore, or the hydro dam now is dry because of a drought and there's no power to that. You know what I mean? So I think there's an opportunity with that. The risk, and this is something that I'm kind of obsessed with, but unfortunately haven't had the time to dig into it. So it's obsessive without, any like useful knowledge at all. But as these countries are going for ever more, but it's inclusive of AI, not exclusive to it. As countries are going more towards ever more technologically advanced military weaponry, we're going to buy ourselves an interoperability and coalition problem if we don't think about not only do our radios talk to each other, but are we both accounting for, as I mentioned in the research report, the readiness drain of all of this? And again, I think there's a way to talk about it because we already have a lot of data on what happens when a country cannot send its forces because of a wildfire, or we can't show up because we're bogged down dealing with a flood or whatnot. So all that to say, I think the risk is going to be and continue to be, I think, coalition operations in a changing climate that we're going to have to deal with again through unpacking how we're all talking about the defense industrial base and technological demands. But the opportunity through using AI is maybe a bit of a stalking horse for getting those conversations off the ground. I don't know, maybe I'm being a Pollyanna, but I think there's something there.
Great, thank you. So I have a few questions from our public. One has to do with geoengineering. If I understand the long comment here, that your talk was through a lens of conventional climate change effects, higher temperature and extreme events and whatnot. But how might what you're talking about be affected by geoengineering proposal? And I read the question here and a comment here. It's a bit long. I can share it to you later if you want, but I think it's how the human world is also changing because of climate change. Because I would add to that what I've been working on with a few colleagues, which is the energy transition, right? So geoengineering and the energy transition are sort of international relations effects of climate change, so to speak. So how does that I guess affect what you're talking about? And if you don't mind, I'll just mention and give you the other question, two other questions too, and then you can figure out because we might be running out of time. So I have one from Martin from CASCOE. How can allies best engage U.S. counterparts in light of your research these days? Uh, Another one I'm sure you'll enjoy. And we have one also about contractors. Are contractors who supply NATO with equipment and often maintain bases, infrastructure, and all that, factoring in climate change in a way that may mitigate some of the issues you highlight? So let's start with those.
Ooh,
I just another question that just popped up, but let's start with those three.
all right. Those are three really good ones and three very different ones, which I love. I hear the geoengineering question. What I'd like to do is send through Bruno some links to some work that the sister center to mine, the Center for Climate and Security, is doing on geoengineering right now. I can't speak cogently to that, and I don't want to butcher what they've been finding, but there is work that we are doing on that, and I'd like to send that your way. In terms of renewable energy, I love that. That is something that I've been working on as well. What we've been finding in terms of the effect of the energy transition on defense has been a little bit interesting because on one hand, yeah, you'll have your the spears thrown that we've heard from Secretary Hegseth about, no electric tanks. Well, then like 6 months ago, they're fielding hybrid tanks. So it's like one standard deviation from electric. So it's a thing. What we realized, at least in the building when I was there, was there is sort of a 2-for-1 benefit of having military equipment that uses less power, less fuel, and that's obvious. I don't need to explain why that's true for anyone that's on the call. But in terms of the broader national push for renewable energy, what that's done, and I think what it proposes to do, is it releases the national budget from having to spend a gigantic quantity of money on one-time use fossil fuels for renewables that then pushes a lot more money, for better or for worse, towards the defense area. And one particular example that's interesting to me is Japan, because Japan imports like 97% of the energy it requires. Most of that is tanked oil through the Strait of Hormuz. So they're in a bit of a pickle right now. But they're also at the same time trying to bulk up their defense procurement, which is its own historical thing, which we won't get into right now. But if Prime Minister Takaichi is trying to get more money for high-end capability and deal with spending a gargantuan amount of yen on tanked oil from Iran, she can't really do both while also maintaining the social safety net that the Japanese public is really used to. So which one would crack first? As leery as she is about things like solar and wind, she's still moving forward because there's a math equation that has to be balanced with that. So it does not necessarily solve the are we spending money in a better way when we have a defense budget, but the renewable energy debate, I think, is going to be an interesting one to watch in terms of the pressure that it kind of lets some of these countries have a little bit less of. I'm going to take the contractors one next, and then I'll go to the U.S. counterparts. On the contractors, I think that the degree to which contractors are incorporating climate change is in direct relation to whether or not their sponsor kind of, and I'll put allows in quotes, allows them to. Contractors, at least in my own context in America, their whole business model is to bend with the will of the contract, with the sponsor. So in the Biden administration, the primes were really into renewable energy. They were really into solar panels. They're really into winglets on airframes that use less JPA. Now in the Trump administration, not so much. So it's going to be an interesting thing to watch whether or not the contractor is going to be kind of the tail that wags the dog in the future, just by virtue of the fact that they're not going to be able to reliably say, we're going to give you good value for money. Because if they're building a system that does not include, say, changing ocean salinity on the effect of a sonar, then the electric boat that creates the Ohio-class submarine, they might not get another contract because that boat is only going to be operationally viable for maybe 5 out of the 50 years that we're expecting it to be. So the contractor might end up pushing this a little bit. Now, they also might end up doing it wherein they kind of bake that climate change realism in and call it, we've made it more operationally resilient. We're not going to tell you why or how, and that could be how they do it. But depending on how the political wind shift in the United States, at least in terms of the administration, regardless of party, being a lot more objective about climate change, I think it might release the contractors to go after new designs for weapon systems that will allow them to get more contracts, because the stuff that they're going to be producing is going to be longer lasting. In terms of U.S. counterparts, geez, why did I leave this for last? This is the hardest one. I mean, listen, it is an immutable truth that the U.S., right or wrong, views itself as the cornerstone of global power, the cornerstone of global stability. Whether or not the national security strategy that the Trump administration put out that says, we're all about the Western Hemisphere and good luck everybody else. Clearly, that's not. The United States is kind of the United States of amnesia. We don't quite know how to not get, remain a global power in our actions. So going by what the administration is doing, which is to say, continuing to be involved in the world to some degree, and certainly in the Department of Defense, beating the drum on effectiveness and capability and lethality and all that stuff. Speaking to counterparts in the language of resilience, I've seen working pretty well, because resilience is a neutral term. Resilience speaks to your ability, as I say in the report, your ability to counter the very best that an adversary can throw at you. To the extent that those operational impacts mirror almost completely the effects of climate change, then you can harden an airbase in a way that makes it less vulnerable to coastal erosion or storms or whatnot, and also a drone attack or a DF-21 or whatnot. So I would say talking about warfighting through that lens, at least in the experiences that I've had since January 25, have been more often than not effective. But I would say this is also, I think, a good topic to discuss either in a sidebar coffee at the Montreal Summit in October, or in fora like this, where we can kind of compare notes on the conversations that we've had and learn from each other on that too.
Well, thank you for giving it your best here. We've had that conversation before about that. So, okay, so we're running out of time, but let me give you one last question that you can maybe answer in 30 seconds if you can, or something like that. I have two actually. So one is about large-scale variability in climate change, how that might affect its planning. I mean, we did get a reply to that about whether there is variability in the El Nino effects sort of thing. But how do you think, or does it matter that there is such a climate variability in how NATO can incorporate climate change into its planning and warfighting? So hopefully I summarize the question and the comment. Well, the other one is more specific to the Arctic. I don't know, Arctic and polar region, so I don't know if you have anything specific here to say about that. But the question is how do you see what's happening there in those regions, especially the Arctic? How do you project military power being affected in the long term in the Arctic and polar region? So you do what you can. You do your best here. What time do you have left? I'll give you a minute and a half if you don't
Oh,
mind.
such largesse. I'm drunk with power. I'll take the Arctic first. I think I wish Iris Ferguson were here, because what I'm about to say I think would make her punch me in the face. I don't necessarily buy the logic that just because the sea ice or the polar ice caps are melting and new pathways for shipping are being created, that it's going to perforce create conflict. I don't think that's true. But what I do think is true is it's going to make it a lot harder for things that we've taken for granted in terms of operational capabilities to remain. So, for example, like I said, the permafrost thaw for a lot of our ground stations for satellites. I mean, that really is a major problem. So my immediate answer to the military power, and I'll get to the projection in a second, the military power thing with the Arctic, I think it does a lot of damage to our upstream assumptions about the reliance of capabilities that we've got that demand being in the Arctic all the time. On power projection, obviously, we love the ability to be everywhere and anywhere all the time. And if you have a warming climate that is changing the Arctic very, very quickly, what that does is the upstream inability to plan and procure effectively. You're not sure anymore whether you need to buy, bright white suits for your soldiers to wear when they're doing field training exercises, or brown suits because the snow is gone. Or you don't know if you need to buy certain equipment for extreme cold or a whole bunch of other stuff. And now your procurement process and your planning process and your budgeting process kind of gets sand thrown in the gears, and that slows things way down. Which gets a little bit, I guess, to the climate change variability question. And if I understand the summary right, the challenges of planning for a opaque future where it's going to be different, but you're not quite sure how. This is where I think going back to the defense industrial base and technology, I think is going to help us. And I can't believe I'm saying this, but it might be a way to actively and effectively use artificial intelligence insofar as you can ask an LLM to chew on a gigantic quantity of data and come up with some ideas, quote unquote, because it's a machine, it's math, it's not a person, but some suggestions based on pre-existing data of how do you design or plan for a multitude of contingencies in terms of a climate or weather, and you only have X amount of money to spend. Like obviously like Fremen suits and Dune or something like that. That could be great. But we're going to have to do a lot more with the same euro or the same dollar. And I think if we can figure out how to do that, then the planning processes we have can remain. But we're just not going to be able to have like a whipsawed budget process every couple of years, like, oh no, it's going to be hotter. Oh no, it's going to be colder. That's not going to work. That's not a that's a terrible answer. But what I'm trying to say is being able to leverage the processes we've already have in place to buy things that we need while maximizing the last marginal euro, the last marginal dollar for flexible purposes, I think is going to help us a lot. I did my best.
And it was great. Thank you very much, Caroline. So we're out of time. On the behalf of Casco and myself, thank you very much for being with us and giving us all your time and insights. Always a pleasure. And for our community of practice and people listening to us, stay tuned for the next episode, which should be confirmed soon on June 16th with Dr. Duncan DePledge about low carbon warfare and the energy transition sort of nexus with climate change. So again, thank you very much, Caroline. Thank you everyone for to everyone being with us, and we'll see you soon. Thank you.